Welcome to the Clear Gun Show. I'm your host, Dr. G, with a PhD. I hope everybody was able to have a fantastic and rejuvenating Thanksgiving holiday. So I take a break for one day, and we have a new variant of interest. Countries are locking down again. COVID cases are spiking across the world, and leaders and policymakers have, in general, lost their marbles. Well, I'm back, and we're here to talk about it all. We're going to spend a good deal today talking about the new COVID variant, B11529, also known as the Omicron variant. So we'll be touching on a lot of things in this variant. We're going to talk about what's different genetically, and we're going to look at the genome and all the different variations that they've found with this one, leading it to be a variant of interest. Then we're going to talk about where it is. Where have they found the original cases? Where have they found new cases? We're going to talk about countries that are locking down in response to this new variant. Now that includes both abroad, like in places in Europe, as well as locally in the US. With this regard, we're going to break down Fauci's pretty insane statements on the CBS Face the Nation interview. We'll be discussing all this and much more on today's episode. So if you're looking for any news regarding Omicron, you're at the right place. Now let's dive on in. So first things first, what makes Omicron so different? We'll start with an article from Fortune that's titled New COVID Variant with, quote, unusual constellation of mutations is already more dominant than Delta in South Africa. The article opens up with a quote that led to the article's title from Tulio de Oliveira, who is the director of South Africa's Center of Epidemic Response and Innovation. So when discussing B11529, which is the Omicron variant, he stated that the new strain has a very unusual constellation of new mutations. The article goes on, B11529 has more mutations to the, quote, spike protein than past variants, meaning that it could hamper the body's immune response and spread more easily. The variant has 50 mutations overall and 32 in the spike protein, the vehicle by which the virus penetrates the body cell and the key target of the majority of vaccines. So we can compare and contrast this strain with other strains. So for example, let's look at the Delta strain's receptor binding domain. This is where the virus first makes contact and binds to the body's cells. Delta had 2 mutations. This is compared with Omicron's 10 RBI mutations. So Tulio released a thread on Twitter breaking down lots of the information that South Africa has right now on this variant. So we'll look at that periodically throughout this episode. So first, let's take a look at the way he displays the genome for Omicron. So he lays it out linearly and he highlights the spike protein of the genome. And now there's a couple of sections here. There's NTD, RBD, RBM, SD1, SD2. So just for orientation, I'm going to lay those acronyms out for you guys so you know what we're talking about. So NTD is the N-terminal domain and RBD is the receptor binding domain. So those two areas typically mediate the recognition of the host cell receptor angiotensin converting enzyme 2, ACE2. So basically this part of the spike protein is just there to identify the cell and say, hey, we're going to come here and we're going to try and get into this cell. Now, a subsection of the RBD is the RBM, which is a receptor binding motif. So within this red and purple section, the Delta strain had 2 mutations, whereas the Omicron strain has 10 mutations. So then SD1 and SD2 are the conserved subdomains of the spike protein segment. And that's a basic look at the spike protein segment on the genome. And that, again, was provided by Tulio de Oliveira. So one of the biggest implications of these mutations is the fact that the vaccine, for the most part, the mRNA vaccines especially, are geared towards spike protein recognition. So they train your cells to see a specific kind of spike protein. In this case, it was the alpha variant spike protein. So with so many changes in the spike protein, there's a lot of concern that this mutation of the virus may be able to evade immunity provided by the vaccine. So it also appears that the Omicron variant seems to spread quite quickly. In less than 2 weeks, it now dominates all infections in South Africa. Now, a unique thing about this variant is that it can be detected by normal qPCR. So real quick, back to the genome sequence picture. The NTD section of the genome sequence on the spike protein, so that's on the far left, that sequence is what is known as highly mutable, and it's especially prone to deletions in the genome. So in the case of Omicron, there is a deletion at the point 69 to 70, which is similar to the alpha, the original strain. And so we can tell by qPCR testing pretty much if you have Omicron or not. So far we're pretty early on into this new outbreak, but it seems to be the case that many of the cases that have this Omicron variant are pretty mild, which is excellent news. Now, it's still too early to say whether this is going to be the case going forward with this variant, but the argument certainly can be made. As with the 1918 flu, right, which was the huge flu pandemic, that virus eventually mutated to be less lethal. And the same thing can be seen with lots of other viruses. Again, it's still pretty early on in this variant cycle, but we do know a lot about COVID in general, even if we don't know that much about this variant, and we should be applying our knowledge that we've gained over the last 2 years and not repeat the same mistakes policy-wise that we did the first time around. But of course, that's wishful thinking. Let's see what countries have been doing so far. So again, South Africa released the information on Omicron, and basically immediately upon that, countries started taking action from around the world. So Israel and UK early on banned travel to South Africa, with the US following shortly after. Now, when I say South Africa for the US at least, that means many countries, not just the country of South Africa, but the southern part of the continent of South Africa. So these include countries like Botswana, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Lesotho, Eswatini, Mozambique, and Malawi. So as we'll see in a moment, there's cases all over the world now of this particular variant. I don't think locking down border access from country to country is going to be particularly effective at stopping the spread of this variant. But furthermore, it's amazing to see how political these responses can be, even when they're kind of laced into trying to be based on the science. So for example, right now Biden says, as we move forward, we will continue to be guided by what the science and my medical team advise. But if you go back just 2 years ago, Biden released a tweet saying, a wall will not stop coronavirus, banning all travel from Europe or any other part of the world will not stop it. This disease could impact every nation and any person on the planet, and we need a plan to combat it. Kamala Harris, the current vice president, also chimed in on this policy, stating, quote, Trump's extended un-American travel ban undermines our nation's core values. It is clearly driven by hate and not security. Now, regardless of the politics of it, I think that it's incorrect to be banning travel from other countries because this virus is not the same as something like norovirus, where if norovirus breaks out on a cruise ship, you can contain the whole thing by not letting anyone off the cruise or by, isolating the people that have it. Coronavirus transmits so easily through the air, through air ducts, through just being near people, that it's ridiculously hard to contain. The symptoms also are delayed from 2 to 12 days, right? So all these cases we're about to see popping up across the world, they're already there. And who knows how many people have it that are, about to get symptomatic in 2 to 3 days. So I don't think this policy is particularly going to be that effective. I just hope that the hypocrisy isn't lost on our current leader in the US, that he was just 2 years ago saying this exact thing is not how you stop COVID, and here he is implementing it, following that up by saying we're following the science. So when Tullio first released his briefing on this new variant, he prefaced it by saying, look, this could be potentially a really bad situation for South Africa because the whole world might discriminate against us for revealing to the world a new variant that we have. Now they revealed the variant ostensibly to let the world know, hey, get ready for this thing. But the world reacted the way that he was saying, or he was hoping that it wouldn't. And apparently on Friday, according to The Guardian, in a heated press conference, the health minister, Joe Fala, said his country had acted transparently by alerting the world to the new variant, and the other countries are acting very draconianly and knee-jerky. So this is not good news for South Africa's already struggling economy. The impact to the economy was instantaneous. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange fell by almost 2% midday on Friday. Scenes like this were also reported across Europe, especially in the Netherlands, of passengers in planes from South Africa not being able to disboard from their plane.
That means for KLM, the Johannesburg flight and also our Cape Town flight cannot enter the Netherlands without any restrictions. So what that means, that is what they are finding out right now. And as soon as I have that information, of course I'll let you know.
So with banning travel from South Africa and barring passengers from leaving planes, how have these European countries done in terms of Omicron? Well, you guessed it, they've got cases of Omicron. So according to the BBC, 13 people tested positive for Omicron on a flight that left from South Africa and landed in the Dutch capital of Amsterdam. So those 13 passengers were among 61 passengers who tested positive for coronavirus. The BBC article continues by saying that Netherlands has increased their COVID restrictions due to the new variant and rising COVID cases. And some of these new restrictions include early closing times for hospitality and culture venues and limits on home gatherings. The article also mentions that Israel is set to bar entry to all foreign nationals, and Morocco banning all inbound international flights for 2 weeks starting on Monday. According to ABC, Israel's health ministry reported on Sunday that it detected one case of the Omicron variant in a person that traveled to Tel Aviv from Malawi, and then on November 22nd traveled from Tel Aviv to Eilat on a bus. They are now asking for all bus passengers on that bus to self-quarantine and be tested. Again, Israel is banning foreign nationals to enter the country for 2 weeks starting Monday, November 29th. What about the UK? According to the Wall Street Journal on November 27th, the UK confirmed its first Omicron case. This new variant has also urged several world leaders to promote vaccine booster programs. Let's take a listen at what the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has to say.
We don't yet exactly know how effective our vaccines will be against Omicron, but we have good reasons for believing they will provide at least some measure of protection. And if you're boosted, your response is likely to be stronger. So it's more vital than ever that people get their jabs and we get those boosters into arms as fast as possible. So from today, we're going to boost the booster campaign. We're already planning to do 6 million jabs in England alone over the next 3 weeks. And now we're looking to go further.
Now, I'm not sure where he's getting these likeliness and reasonable deductions. I guess when he says protection, that's a little better than when they used to say the vaccine will prevent mutations. So by protection, I think he means that maybe if you get the Omicron variant and you have a vaccine, you might not be hospitalized. Maybe. I don't know. And I don't think he knows. However, we have evidence from Botswana, at least, showing that vaccination does not prevent infection of this disease. But also we know from South Africa, as we stated before, that in general, the infections seem to be mild. So on November 25th, the Presidential COVID-19 Task Force in Botswana released this statement basically saying that the preliminary report for the first 4 public cases of this new variant all had full vaccination status. At this time, I think the cases are still mild and there hasn't been a serious increase in lethality or people going to the ICU in Botswana, as far as I know. That is subject to change maybe by the time this episode comes out. Again, this shouldn't be that surprising, especially after going over that brief genomic sequence situation for the new Omicron variant. With so many changes to the spike protein, I can only imagine that it would be easier for this particular variant to at least infect somebody with a vaccine. That's not to say you'll get sick. We don't know. It appears that these patients haven't been too sick. But the infection part, I think, is definitely going to be happening. So according to Politico on November 25th, in light of these new discoveries about the variant, as well as its ability to infect people, both vaccinated and unvaccinated, and the mutations in the spike protein, Portugal announces new COVID restrictions. And again, Portugal is one of Europe's most vaccinated countries. Prime Minister Antonio Costa says, despite the vaccination success, we have to be aware we are entering a high-risk phase because we see a big rise in the pandemic in the rest of Europe, and Portugal is not an island. He then announced a return on December 1st of the state of calamity, which was lifted 4 months ago. So they're returning to full-on COVID wartime. One of the things that stood out to me was, under the new rules, all passengers flying into Portugal will have to show a negative test before boarding, and airlines will face a fine of 20,000 euros per passenger for failing to check. Also, vaccine certificates will be obligatory for entry into hotels, restaurants, gyms, and cultural events. Masks will again be required for indoor public spaces. Visitors to care homes, hospitals, bars, dance halls, and big sports and cultural events will have to show negative tests. So real quick, before going to the US and lockdowns over there, I want to talk about the cases in Portugal so we can compare to the rest of the world. So here are the daily new confirmed COVID-19 cases per 1 million people in Portugal. And you can see at the bottom right of the graph, the tick is starting to go back up again. That's where we are right now. Now here's a picture of the graph comparing daily new confirmed COVID cases per million people in a bunch of countries. You'll see Portugal is at the bottom right still relative to these other countries. Down there is also Botswana, South Africa, and the United States. Now towards the top of the graph, you have Netherlands, Austria, and Slovakia, with the UK right in the middle. And with those same countries, here's a graph of the fully vaccinated against COVID-19 percentage of the population. Again, Portugal takes the cake against all the countries. But as you'll see, and we did this last week, the vaccination status doesn't necessarily correlate with the new COVID cases appearing right now. So I've been saying this for months. If you think that vaccination is the way out of this pandemic, you are mistaken. The reason for this is since the beginning, there's been no metric of success. So the policies haven't reflected the vaccination status. This pandemic ends when you want it to end. If you're vaccinated, you're protected from at least the last 4 variants in terms of severe hospitalization for the most part. Go out and live your life. If you're unvaccinated and you don't want the vaccine, go out and live your life. There's treatments, there's therapies, there's things we can do. We don't need to rely on these mandates to have a safer and better world. On top of that, mandates and lockdowns have exacerbated other problems. For a prime example of this, let's take a look at New York. Reading now from NBC, November 27th. It's coming. New York declares a state of emergency ahead of the potential Omicron spike. So this is New York Governor Kathy Hochul. The declaration goes into effect on December 3rd and will allow the state to acquire pandemic fighting supplies, increase hospital capacities, and fight potential staffing shortages. It would also allow the state health department to limit non-essential and urgent procedures at hospitals. The article then describes what we discussed earlier about the mutations in the Omicron variant, and then rounds off with Hochul again urging New Yorkers to get the jab, noting that just under 10% of adults in the state haven't gotten at least one shot. So she says, quote, "The vaccine remains one of our greatest weapons in fighting the pandemic, and I encourage every New Yorker to get vaccinated and get the booster if you're fully vaccinated." So a little over 90% of New Yorkers have had at least one shot, and the lockdowns are coming again. She also says to get the booster for some reason. I'm not entirely why she is conflating getting the booster with the Omicron variant when there's no data on any such effectiveness, especially with the mutations of the spike protein. And in an example of how these lockdowns and measures actually hamper the community, let's take a look at Mount Sinai Hospital in Long Island.
Emergency room just closed its doors because it just doesn't have enough staff.
It says it had no other choice. This is fallout from New York's vaccine mandate. But now Long Beach left without an ER. News 4's Greg Sergel has been looking into this. He's standing by there live. Greg?
And David, residents of this city by the sea are stunned by the loss of this ER, but the hospital that runs it says it had no choice. Mount Sinai South Nassau Hospital officials told me a little earlier they lost 6 dozen employees today, all unvaccinated workers who the State Department of Health determined could no longer serve patients because they were unvaccinated. Long Beach's only emergency room shut its doors this afternoon for at least a month. The closure came just hours after Mount Sinai South Nassau Hospital alerted this community of the shutdown.
I think it's shameful. I really think it's shameful.
A local civic leader says...
But at least the hospital has 100% vaccination rate, and that's what's important, right? Right? The vaccination rate, not, helping people. Okay. For our last segment, we're going to break down a couple of Dr. Fauci's interviews and what he's had to say so far on COVID and himself. When asked about lockdowns and Omicron, let's hear what Dr. Fauci had to say.
To be seeing more lockdowns again, new lockdowns, more mandates?
I don't know, George. It's really too early to say. We just really need to, as I've said so often, prepare for the worst. And it may not be that we're going to have to go the route that people are saying. We don't know a lot about this virus, so we want to prepare as best as we can, but it may turn out that this preparation, although important, may not necessarily push us to the next level. People talking about lockdowns, people talking about that. Let's see what the information that we're getting in real time tells us, and we'll make decisions based on the science and the evidence.
Always making our decisions based on the science. I guess that explains why Dr. Fauci has been on every side of every issue for this whole pandemic. That also explains the naming of this new variant, in fact. It's Omicron. Why did we skip Nu and Chi? Well, of course, for scientific reasons, except not really. According to the AP, the WHO didn't want to go with new because it would be confused with the other word new, N-E-W, and so people might say, well, this is a new variant, which I guess it is, so it's not that confusing. But also, they didn't want to cause offense by using the letter Chi in the Greek alphabet. Now, ostensibly, that is offending like the leader of China, Xi. But, you know, maybe they just really think that it's offending a lot of people that have the last name Xi in China. I don't know. But either way, that's definitely not scientific. And the whole original point of using the Greek alphabet letters instead of the countries of origin were because originally that was attacked as being xenophobic. So this whole thing is kind of ridiculous and not science-based. But let's see what Dr. Fauci has to say on the state of the science.
So if they get up and criticize science, nobody's going to know what they're talking about. But if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, well, people could recognize there's a person there. So it's easy to criticize. But they're really criticizing science because I represent science. That's dangerous. To me, that's more dangerous than the slings and the arrows that get thrown at me. And if you damage science, you are doing something very detrimental to society long after I leave.
So never one to miss the opportunity to talk about himself. Dr. Fauci, according to him, is in fact the science. And you can't insult him. You can't disagree with him. You can't do any of these things because he is the science. And if you do any one of those things, well, then you're against the science and society is going to crumble. What a delightful individual. It's so surprising that we've gotten so many things wrong with this guy at the helm of the response to COVID. So before signing off, just one quick breaking news announcement. 2 earthquakes have hit Peru the morning of November 28th. One was a 5.2 magnitude in Lima and the other was a 7.9 in northern Peru. The government is assessing casualties and taking next measures. I'll keep you guys posted on this on Wednesday and see what comes of it. So thank you for listening. If you like this show, please share it with your friends. And for all COVID news and policy, please subscribe to this channel. With that, have a great day and enjoy this video, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.